Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the Washington Chess Congress. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I won a fairly nice game against FM Jason Moorfield, and I felt pretty good after that round just because I'd broken the 3-game draw streak that I had with a win, and I can be somewhat of a streaky player at times, so momentum, is something that is really important to me, and a lot of times I ultimately get wins in bunches and losses in bunches, so I thought, maybe this is the start of something good. My opponent in this one was another FIDE master by the name of Vincent Tsay, and if you've been with the Road to Grandmaster series for a while, you might have seen that game because that was Road to Grandmaster number 33 or 34, I believe. I played him much earlier in the year, in February, actually, in Texas. And he's actually a player from the tri-state area. I don't know if he's living in New Jersey or just outside the city, but he's someone that you can sometimes see play at the Marshall Chess Club. Now, Vincent is fairly young. I believe he's a teenager, maybe like 14 or 15, but very talented and also very decent from a theoretical perspective. And I remember the game that I played against him in February. I avoided I tried to avoid the most, heavily theoretical lines of the semi-Slav and wound up not getting any type of advantage whatsoever and unfortunately squeaking out a win down the line. And so I was hoping to kind of flip that script a little bit, not in terms of the result, but just trying to get a little bit more of a position that I like from the opening, because in the game in February, I really did not love my position, and I think I was quite fortunate to eke out a win. So yeah, that's the case that happens a lot of times with juniors. You play people that know a lot of theory, but they do have their rating for a reason, and you try to take advantage of the weaker parts in their game. So anyways, I was white again, and so let's see how I did this time. All right, so I opened with d4. Vincent played d5. Again, I pretty much knew to expect a semi-Slav just because it's what he does. And I went knight f3 here, not committing to c4 right away. And then he went knight f6. And now I went e3. Still a little bit of gamesmanship here. If I'm going to play c4, am I not going to play c4? D4, e3, knight f3 is a setup I have employed many times this year. So it's something that I know pretty decently, and I could always transpose back to c4, but I also just give him something additional to think about. After e3, he played e6, so we have a completely symmetrical position so far. And now I went bishop e2. So, again, still playing very modestly, not committing to anything. But now Vincent played b6. And this is actually kind of annoying for me because b6 was actually what a lot of the people that I'd been playing in Charlotte had been doing in those Norm events when I'd been playing this type of setup. They'd been going for b6 and quick bishop b7, and then really I hadn't really gotten very much in those systems at all. And so I knew that at least Vincent was mildly familiar that I'd done this before, or at least was understood the antidote to playing against this type of setup. And it's kind of funny because in many respects it's actually similar to the game I played with colors reversed just the round before, because I gave a pretty decent soliloquy in that game about the dangers for white of allowing this bishop to b7 and the other one to d6, and the attacking chances that can kind of build up if white doesn't really, play actively in the center. And so I figured, you know what? I'm going to try and play the white side of this position a little bit better than my opponent did in the previous round, the FM Jason Moorfield did, because I didn't see a great way to avoid the particular structure that would come in the game. And so I thought, I'm just going to play it a little bit better, and based upon the things that I learned from that game. So we'll try to notice some of the differences between how I play it with white here and how my opponent in the previous round played it, because it's very similar. So anyways, after b6, I castled, and now bishop b7 came on the board, and now I went b3. And so I'm again still playing with a little bit of gamesmanship, delaying the c4 move, but it is a move I would eventually play. After b3, knight b d7 was played. I went c4 now, and here we can kind of see the same type of position that I had in the previous round. Again, keep in mind some of the details. I'm going to pause the video, or not pause the video, but I'm going to just allow you to take a snapshot once we've both castled and kind of look at some of the differences, and I'll point some of them out. So after c4, bishop d6 was played. Again, this bishop coming to d6. Very interesting. I now went knight c3, which in some lines threatens the move knight b5, challenging this bishop on d6. And Vincent actually castled anyway and was not very bothered by it. Note that in the game I played with black, I actually played a6 before playing bishop d6 because I was worried about this knight b5 thing. And what I realized here is that knight b5 is actually not a big deal, because if I go for this move, black will just go bishop e7 and then actually play a6 and bishop d6 on the next move and get the tempos back. So it's not a huge deal at all. Instead, I decided to play bishop b2, and now a6 was played, just making sure that b5 square is ultimately covered. And now rook c1, just putting pressure on the c file. And now queen e7. And here I played queen c2, teasing some pressure on the c file still, but also entertaining my next move. And now we're going to stop after black's very next move, rook a c8. And so what are the differences here between this position with white and the one that I'd had in the round before? Well, one of the differences is that in this position, my bishop is actually on e2, my light squared bishop, instead of on d3, as it was in the way Moorfield played it. And one of the differences here is that it actually allows my queen to come to f5 in these positions where I can play c takes d5, e takes d5. And that actually I thought would be a little bit more advantageous, because with my queen being closer to my king would feel a little bit more secure. So that was one thing I thought was a nice nuance. The other thing is that if I keep my bishop on e2, or essentially on this diagonal, instead of rerouting it to f5, I thought that black would have to worry about this a6 pawn in certain variations. And so it just made it a little bit more annoying for black to kind of hold together the queen side properly, and I thought that would be a helpful difference to me. And so those are the initial kind of observations I made. And again, I recognize that if I do nothing, black will slowly build up with rook f8 and sometimes, knight e4 in certain positions. And I can't really allow that. So I went rook fd1 first, just to kind of keep the tension for just another move. And then after rook fe8, I played c takes d5. And after e takes d5, I went for the move queen f5. And this was the setup that I thought, maybe I could play this one a little bit better than my opponent did in the previous round. And my idea was, in these types of positions, I can go queen h3 if harassed with g6. And with queen h3 and g3, my queen can sometimes either fianchetto on g2, or even sometimes actually go to f1, from where it would actually attack the a6 pawn. And so just to give you a little slice of what that could look like, let's say g6, queen h3, h5, g3, and then let's say king g7, and now queen f1. And I actually thought this would actually be very, very annoying for black, because if you go a5, then the b5 square is sensitive, and I might consider knight b5 and just get the bishop pair, because you can't move the bishop, because then c7 would hang. And I just figured that these positions would offer me really, really promising chances, because, again, how do you defend the a6 pawn? I mean, you could go for b5, but that also is quite double-edged, because then you're basically admitting to the c pawn either being backward forever, or ultimately, playing c5 and giving the d pawn, making the d pawn essentially an isolated pawn. And so I thought that these structures could be a little bit easier to play for white, although obviously they're still very, very dynamic and tough. They are tough. But that was kind of my concept, and I thought it was an interesting one. again, I felt a lot more confident about this because of the way, because I'd had a game in the system the round before, so at least I kind of knew where the general plans were. The other thing that's kind of a difference in this system, and compared to my previous game, is my knight has actually stayed on c3. If you can recall against Jason actually played knight e2, and then this knight on e2 actually wasn't really doing very much. At least on c3, I actually discouraged the c5 break a lot because I'm still pressuring the d5 square in a lot of different ways. And in fact, if you play c5 here, one of the things I actually strongly considered was actually just taking on c5 and then actually giving an exchange sacrifice with knight takes d5. And my point was that if this type of position, White would actually have pretty good compensation because White already has a pawn for the exchange. The a6 pawn is also attacked, and my bishop on e2 can really be quite dangerous when it comes to c4. And I thought that at the very least White isn't worse because I can always play g3, blunt the bishop on d6. These pawns are split. It just felt to me that White has quite a decent initiative here. So that was kind of what I was thinking about all the time, and that was kind of my justification for this setup. And I thought, this is an improved version of what Jason got against me. Now, fortunately for me, or maybe unfortunately for my opponent, Vincent almost immediately took a step in the wrong direction and played the move knight e4. But unfortunately, this move is not good. And I mean, in positions where my queen is still on c2, it's playable. Like if let's say I went g3 here, now knight e4 is very playable. But the difference is with my queen on f5, very, very active, and on the king side, you actually don't really have time for this. And it's just a step in the wrong direction. Instead of knight e4, there are a few better moves were rook c d8, getting the rook to the d file now, entertaining c5. That was playable. Also, g6, very playable, just challenging the queen from f5 right away. We might get something similar to the line I showed with queen h3 and g3. Those were two much better moves, sticking with the themes of the position. This move knight e4 just does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is because of knight takes e4. Now, initially, when I was looking at this position, I was thinking, well, isn't the d5 pawn hanging? Can I do something with that? And I thought for quite a while about it, but ultimately I rejected it. I thought there was some knight takes d5, and there was something in this position that bothered me. I'm trying to remember. But tactically, this move just doesn't work. What was it? I think it was bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and knight takes f2. And the problem is that my d1 rook is being attacked, and e3 is uncovered. And if I go king takes f2, queen takes e3 check, is a huge problem for my king, because now queen takes e2 also comes with check. b2 drops off the board, and black's actually just completely winning, being a piece up. And so this position after knight takes e3, knight takes f2 is actually extremely problematic and not very desirable. Another thing that's funny about it is if I go rook e1, after queen takes e3, there's now even discovery, smothered mates going on. Let's say I just play bishop a1. Now we have this type of windmill stuff that you can see in all the tactics books all over the world. So definitely something I wanted to avoid. And again, this tactic actually is dangerous and comes into play because the rook does leave that f1 square in a lot of lines, and then f2 becomes more sensitive. That was also the case in the Moorfield game. Anyways, though, I took on e4, and I actually did so quite quickly because I saw a very, very promising continuation after the move d takes e4, which was played. Note that queen takes e4 is also a move in this position, but it's not very desirable. Or excuse me, it's not a move at all because the d7 knight is actually hanging. But I was going to say in general, even if the d7 knight wasn't hanging, typically trading queens in this type of structure is not what you want to do, because white actually has the better pawn structure typically long term, because if you ever play c5, you give you give black hanging pawns and 3 pawn islands. So usually a queen trade is not something that white will mind in a structure like this. But anyways, after knight takes e4, d takes e4 has to be played. And here I played the move knight e5. And this was essentially my idea, and it's actually extremely, extremely annoying for black to deal with. So what's the threat? Well, the initial threat is this knight on d7 is attacked multiple times. Now, the thing is, if you move that knight away, in many positions I actually have bishop c4, adding more pressure to f7, and that's extremely unpleasant. And I also have the move knight c6 in some lines, just attacking the queen and putting a clamp on the bishop on b7. And you never really want to give up the light squared bishop for white's knight, because the bishop pair then would be a factor, and the light squared weaknesses in the wake of the absence of that bishop would start to tell. And so that's actually a huge issue, is you kind of have to deal with this knight on e5. And yeah, here's where the other problem lies, because bishop takes e5 is pretty much forced. If you play knight takes e5, I actually have d takes e5, and after bishop takes e5, it would seem like black is just winning a pawn if white trades everything. But the issue here is white has the move rook d7. And yeah, just a very, very annoying position, because c7 will drop. If you go queen e6, challenging the queen on f5 and the rook on d7, after queen takes e6, rook takes e6 is forced to still defend the bishop. Bishop takes e5, rook takes e5. Now I have, I can just take on c7, actually. And, yeah, it's just a huge problem. After rook takes e7, if you play rook takes, white basically wins on the spot, because this piece is lost and there's the threat of checkmate on c8. And yeah, basically the material's equal, but black's back rank is just too much to bear, and these pawns become targets because white's rook is more active than black's. So pretty much, because of this rook d7 idea, and because you can't really tolerate the knight on e5, you actually have to play bishop takes e5. And this is a move that, is just a delight to play against for white, because after d takes e5, you've actually gotten the bishop pair, and you've opened up the diagonal of your bishop on b2 a little more, as well as the open files for your c and d rooks. And so it all of a sudden becomes an extremely, extremely attractive position to play. And the other issue is that in certain lines, like if knight c5 was played, but if you actually take on e5, there is the same problem a lot of the times, whereas there's a rook d7 sighting, which becomes really, really dangerous. So, for instance, let's say bishop takes e5, queen takes, and now rook d7. I'm not taking on c7 right away, right? So this is actually a tempo up on the previous line for black with the queen e6 stuff. But in this particular position, not only am I threatening rook takes c7, there's also bishop c4 a lot of the time. So note, you can't play c5 because then the bishop on b7 hangs. But let's say, what if you play rook c5 and try to nullify the pressure on c7? Well, white can even happily trade, and now after bishop c4, white will recover at least one of these pawns, and the remaining pawns will just be in tatters. Because the structure is so bad for black that all the pawns are isolated and weak, and even the difference in light squared bishops is significant, because this bishop is stuck behind one of its pawns, whereas the one on c4 has a lovely outpost reinforced by its pawns. So yeah, white would probably just be winning there. And so after, this d takes e5, you can't even take the pawn on e5. And this actually means that white has the two bishops and even material, which is just a dream. So black pretty much did the next best thing, was to play knight c5 and essentially save the knight on d7 and try to limit my counterplay on the c and d files. And this is actually a decent practical chance, because in a lot of lines, black is trying to play knight e6 and kind of stabilize the position. With the knight on e6, my bishop on b2 is permanently blocked in the diagonal, and the knight would protect c7. And so that would be kind of a nice stabilizing force. And then as well, in certain endgames, black would actually have a 3 versus 2 on the on the queen side because my pawns are actually doubled on the e-file. And so that would pretty much be the best case scenario that black can get in a position like that. And I really did not want to allow knight e6, and so I played the move bishop a3. And my idea here was that the double pawn is not so important. So if I basically wind up, losing the double pawn, that's fine. To me, it was really important to ensure the knight does not get to e6, and that I basically incur some structural damage on the queen side. Because I thought that even if I was a pawn down, it would be so unpleasant to defend those weak pawns that it would give white good practical chances. So after bishop a3, black played g6, hitting my queen on f5. And I think this is actually a good intermediate move because you actually are planning to take the pawn on e5, but you want to give your king an escape square first, and that's really good decision making by Vincent. I now actually also have a choice to make, and I think that's the other thing that makes this move kind of clever, is you forced me to make a decision, and I wasn't really, sure which one was best. And I thought for quite a bit here, trying to figure out where should my queen go. Should my queen go to a square where I'm protecting the pawn, or should I just move away? Because if I play a move like, queen f4, I'm actually, inviting a queen trade. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should keep the queens on the board here because I have decent control of the open files, and I wasn't so sure that this move, queen f4, would work out. But it actually turns out it's quite a good one, and I can actually play queen f4 and then actually trade on c5, play rook c2, and actually try to take advantage of the c pawn on c5, but then also the one on c7. And the computer line goes queen takes f4, e takes f4, e3, and then g3. And remarkably here, white is significantly better because of the presence of these pawns. I will recover my pawn. I am still a pawn down, but I will recover the one on c5, and then the remaining ones will be split, which will be really, really tough to defend. Instead, though, I thought I should probably keep the queens on the board, and that's why I played the move queen h3. And it was not the best move per se, but I think it still kept some pressure in the position. And I was just trying to entertain some threats and some practical chances in the position. Anyways, after queen h3, black played queen takes e5, and now I played bishop takes e5 and b takes e5. And I thought here for a little bit, thinking, okay, I'm a pawn down, but my rooks are still quite active. The bishop on b7, I think, is worse than my bishop on e2. And I thought I had a moment to get a little bit active here, and so I played the move queen d7. And I thought queen d7 was actually really strong. Part of the reason I did this is because I didn't like that black sometimes had this move f5. And it seemed that with f5, my queen was actually kind of stuck on the king side and out of play. So I thought queen d7 was really smart because it centralized my queen and also prevented the black rooks to contest on the d file. Because now rook d8 is just a blunder because I can actually take on d8 and get two rooks for the queen in a position where the weaknesses here would just make it so easy to collect the black pawns. I mean, after king g7, I can just go rook d2, double my rooks, and then just mop up. And, white would pretty much be winning very, very easily without any black counterplay because black actually has no targets against my position. So, yes, I thought queen d7 was really good because it kind of took control of the d file. And, I thought actually I was close to winning here. But it turns out that things are not so clear, and Vincent actually defended pretty well. He started with the move queen f6, which is a very, very good move, which does a few things. First of all, it entertains rook d8 now, challenging for the d file again. It also, in some lines, eyes some important dark squares on the queen side, particularly b6, and it just keeps the queen very flexible. So it's still eyeing some king side squares, eyeing the queen side as well, and also entertaining, challenging on the d file. I now played queen d2, retreating my queen and trying to reposition it towards some squares on the queen side where I can still get some pressure on the queenside pawns. The computer considers h3 a little bit stronger, and the line it gives is rook e d8, queen a4, queen b2, and bishop f1. But I did not like variations where the queen was actually getting into the second rank, and that's why I kind of rejected this. I thought that, at least with queen d2, I'm actually preventing queen b2 and getting to a5 without allowing that. So after queen d2, rook c d8 was played. I think that is the right rook. You always ask which is it, the right rook or the wrong rook? But the c rook was really not doing anything behind the c7 pawn, so I think that's the right rook. And now I played queen c2. And again, my thought process initially was, you know what, I want to get to a5. But then the more I looked at it, I just did not like this queen coming to b2 and challenging the second rank. So I thought it makes sense to be a little bit more patient. And you can see here that I'm still a pawn down, but I thought that I was really playing with zero risk because these pawns are so weak that even if I somehow blundered and traded some pieces, it seems very unrealistic that black can make use of such a majority. So I just tried to keep some pressure in the position. So instead, after queen c2, black played rook e5. This is a good move, just protecting the c5 pawn now. And maybe in some lines even entertaining the rook shifting over to the king side with g5 or f5. And now I played the move rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and bishop c4. And my idea here was that by trading the rooks, I actually dragged the queen away from the f6 square, which I thought was a pretty good square, where I was eyeing the queen side, eyeing my king, maybe eyeing the f2 pawn. And in some lines, I thought it'd be a little bit out of place because I get rook d1 in with tempo. And then the thing I liked about bishop c4 is I eye this f7 pawn, which could be a potential target, while also freezing the b7 bishop, because the bishop can't really go to d5 right now because then the a6 pawn was hanging. And basically, with bishop c4, I'm also covering the d5 square, which prevents the rook on e5 from just doubling on the d file. After bishop c4, black played rook e7, and this is actually another pretty good defensive move because you're doing two things. You're defending the f7 pawn, and you're also trying to double still, and that's really, really important for black to ensure that he doesn't concede the one open file. After rook e7, I went bishop f1, now attacking the c5 pawn, and essentially just saying, hey, if you go rook d7 now, I can take on c5. Black now went rook e5, and this is almost like a implicit draw offer because he's basically saying that if I go bishop c4 back, he's just going to go rook e7, and he's comfortable with the draw here because of the nature of his weak pawns on the queen side and the bishop stuck behind the e-pawn. But I really was not trying to get a draw here. I just did not feel that would be the proper result for this game because I just seemed like it was much easier to play the white position. And so I actually just played h3 here, declining that repetition, and I thought making a useful move, giving my king an escape square. After h3, black played h5, and this is actually another pretty good move. I mean, basically with h5, you're taking more space on the king side, and in some lines, you might even consider h4 fixing my pawns on light squares. That's something you might want to do in an endgame because it might be attractive to do that. Just a very, very useful move. I now played bishop c4 though, because I thought that now with the difference with h3 and h5 included, I thought that h3 did make my king more secure, and it meant that I didn't have to worry about a doubled rook being checkmate on d1 if my queen vacates the c2 square. So in previous lines, if I left c2, there was rook e7, rook d7, and rook d1 mate, but not mate. I mean, my bishop could retreat back to f1, but now I can actually just go to h2 if I wish, and I thought that was a significant difference. After bishop c4, rook e7 was played, and here I played bishop f1. And again, we're kind of doing this dance where I'm attacking c5, and he could choose to go back, or he could choose to do something else. And he now played rook e5, again saying, I'm very, very pleased with the repetition. What are you going to do? And now I went a3. So basically I was saying, you know what? No repetition, dude. We are playing this game. I'm going to make moves, even if there are no moves to be made. You're going to have to do something. And a3 is a very cheeky move because it's not really threatening anything. It's just saying you have to do something, and maybe you're going to do something that compromises your position. After a3, Vincent played the move rook e6. And this is actually a really, really good move. And it also doesn't compromise his position, because I can't take on c5 now because of rook c6. And now essentially my rook and queen are skewered. And this is not losing for white, but it's also not enough to win. I was looking at queen takes c6, bishop takes c6, and rook takes. But yeah, there's not enough in this position to win. Black can play a5, and if we could trade these pawns, I can play b4. We could trade. Once the b and c pawns come off the board, white has a pretty reliable fortress, but no winning attempt. So essentially, I didn't want to take on c5 and simplify like that. Instead, I played the move a4, and this is actually now really cheeky, because the point is I went a3, and now I went a4. Like, I don't really have a point. I'm just kind of making moves and asking Vincent to show me something. Now Vincent played bishop d5, which is also quite a reasonable move, actually. Since I didn't actually decide to occupy the diagonal myself with the bishop on c4, it actually makes sense for the bishop to take control of it, especially because the rook on e6 now is actually defending the a6 pawn. So all of a sudden, this bishop is actually not as bad as it looks. And I was actually very, very surprised to see this move, because to me, it seemed like it was going to be a blunder to put the bishop in the line of fire of a potential pin with rook d1. I thought, surely that's not a good move. But it turns out to be totally playable. Remarkable. I played a5 in part because I realized that if I go rook d1, black would just go rook d6. And it didn't seem that there was anything here. And now bishop takes b3 might be a move, or even bishop e6 retreat might be a move. Point is that I can't go queen takes c5 because bishop takes b3 just trades too much. Basically rook d6, queen, let's say cd6, or maybe even, cd6 is a little bit better. And the a4 pawn is hanging, so I don't have time to corral a6. And if I move the queen away, I don't know, somehow I was not believing in this position, although right now I'm not finding a move for black that doesn't defend the bishop and also defend the a6 pawn. So there was something here that bothered me, and I did not believe this to be a serious winning attempt. But I'm also not finding why I didn't believe that, so go figure. Anyways, instead I played the move a5, and I actually thought this was kind of a clever move because it did two things. Firstly, it stopped rook b6, which was an idea to try and target my b3 pawn in certain variations. And the other thing it did is it actually fixed the a6 pawn in a light square. And so all of a sudden, if the heavy pieces come off the board and I play bishop takes a6, I think I'm actually completely winning because the a pawn would be too much for this bishop to handle. So all of a sudden I thought certain endgames would be favorable to me, and that made me more optimistic about my chances. After a5, Vincent played rook d6 anyway, and now I played the move queen takes c5, and I thought this was actually a better version of the position where my rook would be on d1, because now I actually have pressure on the c7 pawn. But actually, after queen takes c5, Vincent very quickly played bishop takes b3, and then it kind of dawned on me that I actually can't take the c7 pawn, because that would actually be a huge blunder. If I go queen takes c7, black would happily take and go rook d1, and this pin would be really, really disastrous for me because it's very, very difficult to deal with, and it forces my rook to, basically stay on the c file, essentially stay on the c file and cover those squares. And black does have this threat of bishop a4 and bishop b5. So I'd pretty much have to very quickly play g3 or g4, put my king on g2, but there are no winning chances for white here at all. And, white actually has to be a little bit careful. So instead, I played the move queen a7. And my idea here was that I'm entertaining, I'm putting some pressure on the a6 pawn in certain lines, but I'm also preventing black from actually going for this rook d1 maneuver, because if you go for rook d1 now, I thought I actually had some dangerous checks like queen b8 or queen a8 or something like that. Now, I should say here, because the game ends fairly abruptly in a few moves, that my opponent was under very, very, very serious time trouble. And I think it was a product of the opening. Again, I was playing very cagey. I obviously tried to avoid his semi-Slav. And, I waited to play c4 and then played b3 and bishop b2. And I basically was not trying to get anything theoretical. And the benefit of doing this was that Vincent was actually thinking a lot on every move. And to get to this position and to defend as tenaciously as he had with those weak pawns, he spent a lot of time. And so after queen a7, he went rook d2. And I thought, okay, well, this is actually going to go really well for me, because now I'm actually getting the a6 pawn for free. But it actually turns out it's not so simple, because with rook d2, he's actually threatening queen f6. And all of a sudden, my king is under serious fire because I can't push the f-pawn. So fortunately for me, I did play queen takes a6, and it does actually cover the f6 square. So there's no threat with queen f6 and queen f2 right now. But it's actually still a position that's completely fine for black. The computer actually gives it zeros. And when I was looking at this position, I thought white must be significantly better, because I have this dream scenario where my a-pawn is actually a runner versus the c-pawn, and the a-pawn's more advanced. But the key thing to notice here is that this rook on d2 can actually get behind the pawn, and the bishop on b3 is actually well placed to actually support the rook on a2, but also cover the diagonal and the potential weak point on f7. And so because of that rook a2 concept, and in some lines even queen d2, entertaining a battery on f2 again, black's actually completely equal. Fortunately for me, though, after the move queen takes a6, Vincent thought a little bit too long and wound up flagging in this position. And so I actually won on time. But I'm just going to point out that rook a2 here would still hold the balance, and the position would be equal. And yeah, it's quite unfortunate for Vincent that he flagged here, but this position would have still been very, very difficult to play for both sides, and I would have had to contend with this queen d2 threat. Anyways, I wound up winning on time. It gave me my second win in a row. I was kind of, getting that momentum that I was searching for, and, getting back up to the top places in the tournament. So that was a nice feeling. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.